It's hard to think of a more iconic car than the 1957 Chevrolet. This last of the so-called Tri-5 Chevrolets, the 1955, 56, and 57, has been a prize collectible for numerous years, and there's good reason. The 57 Chevrolets are great-looking vehicles, and they also featured some excellent mechanical bits with a few exceptions that we'll talk about here. But they offered so much to the buying public at such an affordable price point that they instantly became icons. Interestingly, they weren't even necessarily the best sellers of that particular year either. But the 1957 Chevrolet has many different elements to it and probably quite a few facts that you didn't know. So in this video, what we're going to do is talk about the top 10 facts that you probably didn't know about the 1957 Chevrolet. Put a comment in the comment section for the ones that you didn't know if I missed any, because I can only highlight 10 in this video, and there are many more to talk about this excellent vehicle. Let's get started with number 10. And at number 10, we have that the 1957 Chevrolet wasn't necessarily the best-selling vehicle in that particular calendar year. Now, the 1957 Chevrolet ads called it USA #1. Well, that wasn't exactly true. So as 1957 finished, Chevrolet produced 1.505 million of these 1957 Chevrolets. Yes, Chevrolet alone was producing well over 1 million cars. But Ford actually had achieved the undisputed crown in 1957, and they produced 1.676 million Fords in 1957. So the Ford actually was produced in greater quantities. Now, Chevrolet did brag that they led calendar year production by about 130 units. That's it, 130 units. And they achieved that by some interesting schemes, namely that they counted new 1958 Chevrolets that were sold at the end of 1957 in that figure. But if you want to take a look at the sales figures for 1957 and the production figures, Ford actually beat Chevrolet out. And it actually wasn't a great year for General Motors. Chevrolet dropped in market share from having 27.1% of the market in 1956 to just 24.9% in 1957. Ford rose from 23.7% to 24.9% over that time period, and Plymouth went from 7.8% to 10.7% as they had the all-new forward-look cars. So Chevrolet was tasked with something that was pretty difficult here in terms of achieving great sales when the 1957 Ford came out, as well as those beautiful 1957 Plymouths, and General Motors' overall market share slipped from 52.8% in 1956 to 46.1%. So it actually wasn't a great sales year, despite the fact that this Chevrolet is well known as an icon, even more so than the 57 Ford, and arguably more so than the 57 Chrysler lineups and the Plymouths. Next, let's move on to number 9, and that is the change in location of the outside fresh air vent intake. Now, in 1955 and 1956, the ventilation system would take air from the cowl area just ahead of the windshield, and if you wanted some fresh air, then it would basically let that come into the cabin and flow through and refresh yourself. Remember, these were days really before air conditioning, or many cars had air conditioning, so flows through ventilation and fresh air ventilation was absolutely critical. Now, for 1957, Chevrolet changed the location of those vents to being just behind the headlamp buckets. There's actually a little screen that's right around the headlamp, and the air comes in that area and goes through the cabin. And some of that was perhaps necessitated by the fact that the 57 Chevrolets had a different hood than the 55 and 56s that was actually lower than the 55 and 56s. But it was an interesting approach to getting your flow-through ventilation system, and it actually worked quite well. So it was effective, stylish, all of the above, and was an awesome little feature on these cars. Next, let's move on to number 8. And at number 8, we have that the 1957 Chevrolet, despite it looking materially different from the 55 and 56s, actually shared a number of components. In fact, Claire McKeegan, who was the chief of the Chevrolet exterior design studio beginning in 1953 and continuing through this point and all the way up through the 1964 model year cars, said that the third-year facelift on the Tri-5 Chevrolets was just something they had to do. They had to reuse the rear deck lid, the roof, and the doors. So all those components are common between the 55, 56, and 57 Chevrolet. And this was really a tough feat because they had to beat out Chrysler with an all-new car, those so-called forward-look vehicles. And they also had to beat out Ford, who had an innovative new 57 Ford for that particular model year with effectively what was a warmed-over car. And Chevrolet designers did get some things that they wanted. The front end in particular, the hood was new. It had a lower profile. The 57 Chevrolet was actually 1.5 inches lower than the 56 and was 2.5 inches longer. So it did get a little bit of that lower, longer style, not necessarily wider. But the designers had to make do with that because there just was not the money for this 1957 or for the 1957 car to be all new. Interestingly, the 58 Chevrolet would end up being a one-year only car before it would get completely revised for 1959. But, well, there's a whole story associated with that one too. But the 57 Chevrolet had to reuse a lot of these 56 and 55 components. And one of the reasons, interestingly, that rear deck lid is so high on the 57 Chevrolets is that Chevy actually had a design criteria at the time that specified that you had to be able to carry those farmers' milk jugs in the trunk, standing up, and be able to close the trunk. That is 100% true. And, well, it necessitates a very tall deck lid. And I guess a lot of farmers had Chevrolets at the time. They knew their customer base, and the designers made it look good. And I don't think it took away from the car at all. So there's a few interesting facts in terms of the styling bits that were used over the 56, 57, and so I should say 55, 56, and 57 model years. Let's move on to number 7. And this one's also styling related, and that is that you could actually tell the different series of Chevrolets by the trim on the body side. Now, many people are familiar with the Bel Air on the 1957 model year, and that's because it has that anodized, beautiful aluminum work. It has the gold grille. It has these gold-ish anodized pieces, these 3 little chunks up at the front fenders as well. And, it's just an overall great-looking car. But aside from that, you could tell your Chevrolet by the trim. So there was the Bel Air, as I mentioned, but at the low end of the lineup, there was the 150 that just had this single spear of trim running the length of the body, and then also kind of a, I'll say somewhat vertical, somewhat horizontal line that connected the little dip in the belt line to that piece of trim. Then if you went up to the 210, you got a diving piece of trim from all the way from the front of the car that went to the rear of the vehicle, and then another piece of trim on top of that almost created this little triangle in the middle. So that was a 210. You could tell the 210. And both the 150 and 210 had those little cutouts, those 3 cutouts on the front fenders, but they didn't have that really attractive goldish piece of trim in there. It was just a divot in the fender. And then the Bel Air got not only the 210's trim, but that beautiful piece of brushed aluminum that had that kind of ribbed brushed aluminum piece in between that triangular shaped area formed by the 2 pieces of trim. And you got the gold little doodads up front, those 3 things on the side of the fender, and you got the gold anodized grille. So you got a lot of different things as you went up to the Bel Air. And the trims were different across the 150 and the 210 and the Bel Air. Of course, by the way, they also had wagons, the Handyman wagon, the Townsman wagon, the Nomad, the beautiful two-door wagon for 1957 that really wasn't produced in quantities at all. That two-door wagon, the Nomad, they produced 6,100 of those in 1957. That was all. But again, pretty sweet little facts on the styling. And at number 6, we have that the 1957 Chevrolet had quite a few chassis refinements versus the 1956 version. Though this 57 Chevrolet retained the 115-inch wheelbase of its predecessor, the frame now had a new cross member to beef it up. There was a new front suspension that Chevrolet called the Glide Ride front suspension, new shock absorber valving, and the Husky outrigger, as they were known, rear leaf springs were moved farther outboard to really help with the road handling and the weight transfer in cornering. And it was also kind of an industry trend at the time, but Chevrolet switched to 14-inch tires, and they also ran these at lower PSI. That enabled the car to have a lower ride height, as I mentioned, this 1.5-inch lower ride height than the previous generation Chevrolet, or the previous model year Chevrolet, I should say, from 1956. So quite a few different chassis features on these that help them improve versus the 1956 Chevrolets. Let's move on to number 5, and that is that Chevrolet wasn't totally truthful when it advertised that it was the first in the industry to offer 1 horsepower per cubic inch. Now, many of you have probably seen ads for the 1957 Chevrolets advertising the 283 horsepower from 283 cubic inches. And Chevrolet claimed that they were first in the industry to achieve this 1 horsepower per cubic inch feat. But that's not really true. They just kind of conveniently overlooked the fact that in 1956, Chrysler had a 300B that had a 354 cubic inch Hemi V8 that was rated at 355 horsepower. So actually more than 1 horsepower per cubic inch. And also in 57, the 57 DeSoto Adventurer had 345 horsepower from a 345 cubic inch Hemi. And there were other hot engines of the time that were available in 1957. And some of that was like the Pontiac Bonneville that had a 347 cubic inch V8. It did make 315 horsepower with fuel injection, but still was a hot engine overall. But the fact remains that Chevrolet was being a bit disingenuous when they were saying they were the first in the industry with 1 horsepower per cubic inch. That really wasn't entirely true, as I just mentioned. Let's move on to number 4. And at number 4 is that the 57 Chevrolet has a beautifully concealed gas cap location. Now, it was typical for many cars during the era to have a fuel filler door on one of the sides or to have a fuel filler door behind the license plate. But something that General Motors Design did in particular during the 50s and before, even in the 1940s, was beautifully disguised fuel filler caps. And where is it on this 57 Chevrolet? Well, if you look at the back fin on the driver's side, there's a little area that rotates open counterclockwise. And as you can see here, it is disguising the fuel fill. So you have your fuel filler door right on the back of the car, and it's nice because you don't see the fuel fill door. It's just disguised into the fin. Now, interestingly, they made kind of the same cutout on the passenger side so that it was symmetric between the driver and passenger side, but there's nothing that happens on the passenger side. The driver's side does have this fuel filler door that obviously swings out, so it looks good, it's functional. Wish they kind of did stuff like this on cars today. Now they just have kind of the clunky fuel filler door. Oh well. Let's move on to number 3. And at number 3, we have that the 1957 Chevrolet introduced the ill-fated Turboglide transmission. Now, General Motors was producing some generally automatic transmissions during this time frame. They had the old-school Hydra-Matic that was proven during World War II and actually was pretty bulletproof in its operation. And then Chevrolet had its Powerglide, the 2-speed Powerglide that, while it only had 2 speeds compared to the Hydra-Matic's 4, was extremely reliable, durable, and it did the job. It just had 2 speeds, but, it was good enough for the time. And I have a 59 Pontiac Parisienne with the Powerglide. It works just fine. You do keep waiting for more shifts, though. It's weird to only have 1 shift. In any case, Chevrolet introduced for 1957 a new transmission called the Turboglide that, it would only last from 1957 to 1961. And Chevrolet ended up producing about 650,000 units in total over the course of those model years. But the Turboglide did not have great reliability. It was really a continuously variable transmission almost, similar to the Buick Dynaflow. And it had a series of turbine blades that you could also change the pitch on some of them. I'm not a big transmission expert, but think about it as opposed to a typical transmission with gears that are able to interchange and shift. That didn't exist in this type of a transmission. And more specifically, because no shift occurred in this transmission, similar to the Buick Dynaflow, it allowed for very smooth power application, though it kind of was like a slip and slide Turboglide style transmission. You'd step on the accelerator and the engine would kind of speed up. It's very similar in terms of how it would sound to a continuously variable transmission of modern era, although done completely differently and with considerably more lost power, let's say, to the rear wheels in this case. But the Turboglide, like I said, its main problem was durability. The Buick Dynaflow was a pretty durable transmission by this point, but the Turboglide was not, and so that really sealed its fate. You could not get it in the Corvette. And the early Turboglides from 1957, they had a gear selector that was labeled PRND and then HR for hill retarder. But people mistook that for high range, and so they would leave it in that, and then they'd have transmission issues. So in the next model year, that was changed from HR to GR, grade retarder, so that wouldn't be confused. But this Turboglide was not a well-conceived transmission, didn't work very well, didn't last very long, and was one of the unfortunate issues associated with the 57 Chevrolet. Let's move on to number 2. And at number 2, we're going to talk about some of the crazy design proposals for this 1957 Chevrolet. Now, first, let's take a look at this photo from 1954, where it's starting to have some similarities, let's say, to the final 57, but the grille is totally different. You do have some bigger so-called Dagmar-esque bumper elements to it and these large bumper guards, although the egg crate grille texture is relatively similar to what would end up on the final 57, and that full-width grille is as well. Notice, though, it doesn't appear that those headlamp buckets have the vent intakes that are around them. The hoods over the headlights are not as large as the final version, and those, I guess, rocket kind of forms are on the fender and not on the hood in this case. So a little bit, or I guess a lot bit would change. You also have that Chevrolet emblem that's in the middle of the hood here. That would move down into the grille on a crossbar, and you don't have the V with Chevrolet going across the hood. So some of the badging would change. You also don't have the little dimples, if you will, in the front fenders for the little bright work that would be added to Chevrolets later. Now, here's a different proposal for the front end, and you can see, again, some similarity to the production version, but the egg crate grille texture is missing. You do have that bisected grille. You have some interesting bumper guards, I will say, on this one that didn't make it through, thankfully, to the final version of production. But that bisection, that kind of divider bar in the grille was very similar, although, like I said, the grille texture is absent and very dissimilar. There is no grille texture on this one, but that beautiful egg crate pattern that you would see on the final Chevrolet grille was not here. Now take a look at the rear of this particular clay model, and in particular the passenger side of it. I love, or don't love, I hate that bumper guard form. What in the world were they thinking with this? Thankfully, that did not make it through to production. The driver's side bumper guard is also different from what would make it through to production, but not as offensive as the passenger side. The passenger side is just awful. I don't know what's going on. Thankfully, the designers came up with a better solution there than implementing what you see into production. So there's a few pictures of this 1957 Chevrolet as it was being developed. There was some thought that this was actually originally going to be an all-new car, but that was delayed to 1958. I'm not quite sure if that was true or not, but it is clear that the designers had to reuse a lot of components from 1955 and 1956 on this 57 Chevrolet. Now at number 1, we have the plethora of engine options that were available on the 1957 Chevrolets. I don't think that I have seen a more extensive lineup of engine options and transmissions than what was offered in 57 for Chevrolet. You started with the 235 cubic inch inline 6-cylinder that made 140 horsepower, the so-called Blue Flame 6. Then Chevy still had the carryover 265 cubic inch V8 as its first V8 with a 3.75 inch bore, 3-inch stroke, 8-to-1 compression ratio, 2-barrel carburetor. That made 162 horsepower. Then you had one up from that, the 283 cubic inch V8, the new 283 cubic inch V8 with an 8.5-to-1 compression ratio, 2-barrel carburetor, made 185 horsepower. Then you had one up from that, the 283 with 9.5-to-1 compression ratio, a 4-barrel carburetor, and 220 horsepower. One up from that, 283, 9.5-to-1 compression ratio, 2 4-barrels, making 245 horsepower. One up from that, you have a fuel-injected 283, 9.5-to-1 compression ratio with not, this one didn't have the 1 horsepower per cubic inch, but it made 250 horsepower. Then you're starting to get to the absolute top dogs that were only available with manual transmissions, 3-speed manuals. The first was a 270 horsepower 283, 9.5-to-1 compression ratio, again with 2 4-barrels, but this one making 270 horsepower, and then the final top engine, the 1 horsepower per cubic inch, 283, making 283 horsepower with ramjet fuel injection and a 10.5 to 1 compression ratio. Boy, that is quite the extensive engine lineup. 8 engines in total. And you could get a 3-speed automatic, you could get a power glide, you could get a Turboglide, you could get overdrive in some of these. You couldn't get the Turboglide or the power glide, like I said, on the most powerful, and you couldn't get the Turboglide on the 235 6-cylinder, the 265 8-cylinder. But wow, what an engine lineup and powertrain lineup. And that's probably because Ed Cole, future GM president, was the chief engineer of these 57 Chevrolets, and he wanted these cars to be absolutely spectacular. And this is one of the reasons I think that they're so popular today is just the myriad engine options and powertrain options. And overall, it's a great vehicle. So what did you think of that top 10 list? Did I forget anything about the 57 Chevrolet? Put a comment in the comment section and also let me know what your favorite feature was. Thanks again for watching.